I'm Humayra Gilzai, cultural advisor, speaker, and writer. Today, I'll share with you how regime changes, visionary leaders, and wars have affected the lives of Afghan women in the past 100 years, and how current negotiations with the Taliban could affect the lives of Afghan women. King Amanullah and Queen Soraya made reforms that brought unprecedented changes to the lives of Afghan women. Under King Amanullah, women were granted the right to vote, coeducational schools were open, and polygamy was discouraged, along with setting a minimum age for marriage. The king also abolished codes that forced women to fully cover in public. Queen Soraya was born in Syria. She was educated and appeared in public in Western-style clothes, hats, and blouses. She created women's empowerment organizations, newspapers, and magazines for women. Queen Soraya became an international symbol for women's rights. The queen and king were celebrities overseas and often invited on state visits around the world. Queen Soraya and King Amanullah received honorary degrees from Oxford for their revolutionary work. However, King Amanullah was not as popular at home, where his progressive agenda and fast-paced reforms rattled traditionalists. After an uprising in 1929, the king abdicated first to India and then to Switzerland, where he lived until 1960. Zahir Shah became king in 1929 after the abdication of King Amanullah and a brief reign of Habibullah Kalakani. King Zahir Shah quickly repealed the many progressive reforms of Amanullah and Queen Soraya, including restricting women's rights, closing women-led newspapers, girls' schools, and once again, veiling and women's segregation was imposed. King Zahir Shah was assassinated in 1933 and was succeeded by his son, 19-year-old Muhammad Zahir Shah. Zahir Shah was the last king of Afghanistan, and he ruled for 40 years over an era of peace and stability in Afghanistan. He brought reforms for women, but at a slow pace to avoid the fate of his predecessor. Guided by his cousin and Prime Minister Dawood Khan, Zahir Shah reinstituted many of King Amanullah's reforms, but did so slowly over a long period of time. Under King Zahir Shah, women were eventually allowed to attend university and join the workforce. The striking photo of my mom wearing an off-the-shoulder sweater was taken in 1954. Women in her family dressed in Western-style clothes behind walls of their home, but when they went outside, she had to wear a burqa. It was in the late 50s and early 60s that a series of reforms passed, where women were no longer required to wear the burqa, they could attend university, vote, and enter politics. Progressive and educated families in cities welcomed the direction the country was going. Here are my parents at their home looking like a family straight out of a Western 50s and 60s magazine. My aunt, Shamsi Sadiq, was one of the first women who received a scholarship to study fashion design in Paris. When she returned to Afghanistan, she opened her own fashion design house and became one of the clothiers of the Afghan royal family. While women in Kabul thrived, the lives of rural women differed since they were largely untouched by the governmental reforms that granted rights to women. Dawood Khan, frustrated by the slow pace of change and progress, organized a coup against his cousin Zahir Shah and took power in 1973, renaming the country the Republic of Afghanistan. Dawood Khan became the first president of Afghanistan. He continued to encourage women's rights and made progress mostly in cities, where women went to school, joined the workforce, and took on public roles. He was an autocratic ruler with a preference for his Pashtun tribe, and he alienated other ethnic groups in power sharing and economic development projects. His vision for a modern Afghanistan once again only affected women in the cities, but the rural areas, women still lived under strict tribal, and religious codes. In a bloody coup d'etat in April of 1978, Daoud Khan and his family were massacred by the Afghan Communist Party, backed by the Soviet Union. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the country underwent extensive reforms, some aimed at giving Afghan women more rights. Girls were required to go to school, and there was a minimum age to marry implemented again. Women were encouraged to work, participate in society, and stand equal to men. The urban-rural divide and the central government's lack of control of the provinces prevented the reforms from spreading beyond the cities. In rural areas, Afghans did not welcome the new policies, which were mostly seen as un-Islamic and against Afghan values. Additionally, the Russians' brutal airstrikes on Afghan villages, farmland, cattle, and civilians ignited further resistance against any of the policies of the communist government backed by the Russians. My family was one of the 6 million Afghans who fled the war and became a nameless refugee around the world. During this bloody occupation, 2 million Afghans died. There was insecurity, instability due to mass killings and gross human rights. Thousands of Afghan women became widows and children became orphans. On paper, women in urban areas were granted equal rights, and some did benefit from the newfound freedom, but that was at the cost of millions of Afghans' lives and the independence of the country. While the Russians tried to turn Afghanistan into one of its communist allies, Afghan freedom fighters, Mujahideen, fought against the Russian occupation. The persistent resistance of the Mujahideen, who were ill-equipped and lacking support in their resistance against the Russians, caught the attention of power brokers in the US government. Shortly after, a covert CIA program called Operation Cyclone was launched to provide weapons, training, and funds to the beleaguered Mujahideen to help them topple the Russian government. At its apex, Operation Cyclone was funneling over $630 million of funding annually to the Afghan Mujahideen through Pakistan's secret service ISI. Operation Cyclone, a secret operation, was the inception of Afghanistan and Pakistan's entanglement over an economy of war, which still has reverberations in the country's efforts to reach peace and stability. After years of fighting the Russians, the Mujahideen defeated them. Once the Russian troops left Afghanistan, a civil war erupted amongst the Afghan Mujahideen factions, but a united government was not established. The country came to a standstill for 5 years while the disputing guerrilla armies fought against each other. This caused destruction, stability, fear, and complete societal and social breakdown on a country that had already been wounded by the Russians. After 5 years of civil war and devastation, Mullah Omar organized a new movement with the backing of Pakistan. The Taliban marched in Afghanistan with a promise of peace, stability, and moderate government. The war-beleaguered Afghans welcomed the defeat of the fighting factions of the Mujahideen, and the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan was born. Under the Taliban, most human rights were stripped away from Afghanistan, and the country entered into its worst period of women's rights. Women were banned from going to school, working, leaving the house, speaking in public, and covering from head to toe in a burqa was the law. Additionally, social services such as hospitals, roads, schools, and government offices fell into disrepair. The Taliban regime was isolated since most developed countries did not recognize its legitimacy. This caused further economic instability and higher rates of unemployment, which in turn increased the opportunity for Taliban to brutally enforce its laws on the Afghan people who were cut off from the rest of the world.
The United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps in Afghanistan.
And the targets selected, if successfully destroyed, should permit an increasing degree of freedom over time.
Since the toppling of the Taliban regime and the US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, many promises were made to the Afghan women by Western allies. US Secretary of State Colin Powell declared that restoring women's human rights would not be negotiable. And Prime Minister Tony Blair promised, "We will not walk away as the world has done in so many other times before." And some of these promises were delivered through collaboration with Western allies and Afghanistan's leaders. From 2001 to 2014, Hamid Karzai was the president of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And from 2014 to 2021, Ashraf Ghani. Today, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan has the most modern constitution in Central Asia. Under the new laws, women can work, be educated, take part in government, and vote. For the first time in 2 decades, Afghanistan's First Lady, Ruhollah Ghani, is taking on a public role by implementing programs that encourage and welcome Afghan women to participate in their communities.
When I first became First Lady, I was appalled at the narrative. And the narrative was that Afghan women were really very weak. Afghan women were sitting in the corner of their homes, not doing anything, just being told to do things and being kept quiet. And maybe there is a proportion that are in such situation, but Afghan women in general is a very strong woman, very resilient, a woman that has survived 4 decades of war and has had to be very resourceful in terms of finding the ways to make ends meet for their family, for their children, and even sometimes they were widows. They needed to figure out how to manage without a male support. So it's basically, I think maybe if you want to summarize how I see my role among others is to say Afghan woman is a very strong woman. Afghan women really can deliver, and this is why.
Before Mrs. Ghani's arrival, Afghan women had stepped into the political arena, taking part in both federal and provincial levels. Currently, 30% of the government employees in Kabul are women. The parliament, which is split in the House of People and Elders, is required to award 25% of seats in the House to women. In the election of 2010, there were 406 female candidates for the 64 parliamentary seats. In 2018, 68 required slots were filled with an extra 17 women winning seats in their own right. Similar quotas were implemented in the House of Elders. And a new decree by President Ashraf Ghani requires that 34 provinces appoint women as deputy governor. Even with all this progress, there's much work to be done. Currently, most of the rights afforded to women in the Constitution are not enforced. Federal law is largely ignored in rural areas, where 90% of the criminal and civil disputes are handled by local leaders and jirgas. With increased threats and violence by the Taliban, girls' schools are closing across the country. Progress is slow, and the Afghan government is working towards state building and creating competencies around law, finance, education, and peacekeeping. But with the US's direct negotiation with the Taliban, where the Afghan government and Afghan leaders were excluded, the future of Afghanistan is in a perilous state. Currently, there are strained talks forced upon the Afghan government with the Taliban. I would guess that the Afghan government's peace negotiators are in a conundrum where they're being asked to find a common ground with the Taliban, while the US has already established the ground rules through their own direct negotiations. Many Afghans I know are afraid that the gains made since 2001 could be lost if women's rights become a bargaining chip to reach a peace deal with the Taliban.
Under the Taliban regime, no women or girls had the right to go to school. Therefore, we are afraid that the Taliban comeback can cause us to lose our right to get an education.
There are outspoken Afghan female activists, politicians, and human rights leaders who are speaking up that if too much is given to the Taliban, much will be lost for the Afghan women. We need to listen to them. What they are saying is that Afghan women should be given the universal human rights decreed by the United Nations, and we all enjoy liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, and the right to education and work. A country without basic human rights for half of its population will be like a chair with 3 legs. Let's remember the promises made to Afghanistan in 2001. And let's not abandon the Afghan women again. Thank you for watching the 100-year history of Afghan women. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel, click like, and share the video with friends and family so we all can be agents of change and champions of human rights. Thank you.